Tonight, we proudly introduce the fabulous Eben Kirksey, who is a multi-species ethnographer and a biotechnoscience scholar who works on a variety of really important questions where the intersection of the human and the more than human world becomes a site of really critical inquiry that we've been talking about in our classes. And some of you have been trying to investigate paths of your own to research. And so we're really privileged and lucky tonight to have this talk from Eben's new book. The talk is called We Are All Mutants, CRISPR and Multispecies Futures. Really briefly, this series that Eben is so kind to help us kick off about multi-species world-making possibilities in the more than human Anthropocene is a series I'm curating that is organized by the AMOR MUNDI Multi-Species Ecological World-Making Lab team. And it will host a series of talks by social science and humanities scholars, scientists, artists, philosophers, people doing work on world-making practices, possibilities, and challenges under the unfolding violence of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene or Plantationocene or Anthroposupremacene, as you know I like to call it, or the Extinctionocene, etc., in a world of multi-species entanglements and more than human agents. The series is focused broadly on questions about how we can better co-inhabit our shared world, which is a more than human world, in which we are necessarily and ecologically entangled with myriad other beings. How do we rethink and reenact the human in a world that is facing anthropogenic and capitalogenic ecological catastrophe? We urgently need new visions of who we are and our place in the world as individuals, as societies, and as a species to help us stay with the trouble of the Anthropocene. Rather than giving up hope or fantasizing that some technofix is going to save us. I think the talk will talk about some of the risks of fantasizing about technofixes. Multidisciplinary research, knowledge-making collaborations, and visual cultural interventions all offer critical spaces to reimagine what it means to be human in a more than human ecological world of myriad other life forms that we need to survive and that have a right to survive, whether or not they serve any instrumental purpose for us. We need new narratives of what being and belonging mean, new visions of what it means to live a good, meaningful, fulfilling life as ecological citizens in balance with nature so that we can begin to heal the broken world of the Anthropocene. A brief introduction that does not do justice to the many achievements of our guest, Eben Kirksey. Eben is an American anthropologist and a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's been published in lots of popular media as well as many scholarly journals such as Wired, The Atlantic, Guardian, Sunday Times, and he's a sought-out expert on science and society by the AP, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Democracy Now!, Time Magazine, the BBC, and many other media outlets. So he has a real commitment to speaking across disciplinary boundaries from outside the ivory tower and making knowledge accessible as well as rigorous. Eben speaks widely at the world's leading academic institutions, including Oxford and Yale, Columbia, UCLA, and the International Summit of Human Genome Editing, plus music festivals, art exhibits, and community events. And I have heard cool things about some of the exhibitions that Eben has curated from one of our panelists, Ciclón Olivares. So Professor Kirksey holds a long-term position at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Some of you who are PhD bound in the near future and multi-species inclined, that is one really great place to look forward. And we gave you guys a bunch of links to learn about Eben Kirksey's writing, the book, and also their coronavirus multi-species reading group, and the new and ongoing amazing series that you know I've been assigning to class sometimes, The Promise of Multi-Species Justice, that explores the possibility of justice in more than human realms. And one of the pioneering, I hate to use that word because of all the colonial implications, one of the innovative, shall we say, multi-species, multidisciplinary knowledge-making experiments that really brought this discipline into the mainstream was Eben's multi-species salon. And that was one of the inspirations for our lab, in fact. So we owe a huge debt intellectually, creatively, and also in terms of the courage that this kind of research trajectory has given us to face the really scary world that we're living in, the scarier world that we're going to be dealing with in the near future. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest to speak. And after the talk, we'll have a roundtable discussion with Eben and some guest discussants, and Q&A from the audience. And I expect lots from my students. Extra credit, guys. All right, Eben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And yeah, if you're not scared yet, I think you will be by the end of this talk. And you know, I think in many ways, what I'm going to offer you tonight is a picture of this world of technoscientific dreaming, a world of biopower that we might do our best to resist. You know, I'm going to offer you a history of ideas in genetics, but also these glimpses of an innovation economy that aims to disrupt and optimize life itself. So I've got some slides. Can you all see the slides okay? Yep. And I'm going to start out as promised by going back into history. Back to 1901. So that was the year that this idea of mutation first started to enter the discourse. A Dutch botanist, Hugo de Vries, published this treatise called Mutation Theory. And at that moment, mutation seemed more revolutionary than evolutionary. It seemed like, you know, science in the early 20th century was about to harness the power of evolution and, you know, transform life itself. And here you can see, you know, some plants pictured in this book as evidence of the, you know, power of mutation as they understood it in 1901. So in those days, it seemed like new species could form even faster than Darwin had dreamed. In the early 20th century, scientists worked with fruit flies and a host of other model organisms as they attempted to channel the power of mutation. Scientists tried to induce mutants at will. They wanted to control evolution, to harness its power for human ends, and they had distinctly mixed results. Here I'm drawing on the work of my friend, historian Luis Campos, who describes how theories of mutation were transformed with the dawning of the atomic age. Later on in the 20th century, as fears about radioactive fallout started to proliferate, there were policies that were put into place by governments all over the world that tried to prevent toxic exposures and medical mishaps. But it's at the same time that work was taking place, more in a cautionary vein, you had some of the early work in genetics. This is Watson and Crick. And, you know, Watson in particular inherited ideas about good genes or eugenics that also had a long history. You know, early 20th century eugenic campaigns focused on, you know, the breeding of people who are seen as good. You know, those might be particular ethnic groups, you know, white people, but also the prevention of others from having children. So, you know, that included the disabled, homosexuals, gay people, certain religious minorities. You know, you all know about the Nazi death camps in Germany. These are all outgrowths of the eugenic project. So at this time, so in 1953, when Watson and Crick claimed to have discovered what they called the secret of life, the DNA double helix, they started talking openly about altering the genes of human babies. As an aside, you know, what they did was actually kind of sneak a peek at one of their colleagues' work. They built this model right here out of, you know, basically little pieces of metal, kind of tinker toys. That's what we call them in the US. But a woman did all the hard work. Rosalind Franklin did X-ray diffraction photography, and as a result, she got cancer, and she passed away before the Nobel Prize was awarded to Watson and Crick. So Watson has since become infamous for his association with eugenic thinking. He has demonstrated enduring racism and sexism. And this is really baked into some of our popular understandings of genetics. Based on his public comments, it's clear that he still thinks that certain people have good genes and others don't. He's made comments about African Americans in particular, about women. But recent findings in genomics have undermined his basic assumptions. Not only is there no gene that you can identify for something elusive as intelligence, or even something like sprinting or gayness, we now know that the very idea of good and bad genes is too simple. Each human baby is born with about 30 to 60 idiosyncratic mutations. That means mutations that their parents didn't have. And this is what leads to the talk title, we are all mutants. And this is an idea that I'll come back to. We all have that distinctive genetic makeup that makes us different from every other person on the planet. Hannah Arendt, a Holocaust survivor, warned us about the dangers of trying to optimize good genes. She warned us about the dangers of eugenics. Writing in 1958, as nuclear weapons proliferated and satellites launched into space, Hannah Arendt reported that scientists were striving to, quote, create life in the test tube and, quote, mix germplasm from people of demonstrated ability under the microscope. Researchers claimed that they would create future man within 100 years. And Hannah Arendt had no doubt that they could achieve this as a technical project. Her definitive book on the subject, The Human Condition, also noted that there is no reason to doubt our present ability to destroy all organic life on Earth. I might quibble with that a little bit today. If any of you've read the Multispecies Salon, I talk about hope in blasted landscapes and the sorts of microbes that might proliferate even in the aftermath of an atomic disaster, the sorts of underground caves and these sorts of environments that harbor extremophiles. So, we probably can't, destroy life on Earth. That's probably beyond the power of anthropos. But still, I think Arendt's ideas are very important. Other trends in mutant theory began to develop later in the 20th century. The Harvard biologist Stephen Jay Gould published an essay in 1977 that celebrated mutation as the source of biological diversity. He famously argued that evolutionary change can happen abruptly, with major mutation events producing what he called hopeful monsters. An essay with a related title, The Promises of Monsters, came out a few years later, with Donna Haraway pointing to the various ways that viruses might induce what she called symbiogenesis. This is borrowing a phrase, a term that was popularized by Lynn Margulis. In Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, she claimed that our time is a mythic time. We are all chimera, theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. Her manifesto pointed to the blasphemous and subversive possibilities contained in emergent technologies. That essay was mostly about robotics and cybernetics, but she also made some important gestures to genetic engineering. I was checking into a hotel in Hong Kong when these techno-scientific dreams suddenly became reality. There was a guy sitting in the lobby, Dr. Jiankui, who was trying to explain this experiment that he had done with CRISPR to Jennifer Doudna, one of the scientists who pioneered this technology. I went up to my room. I was supposed to give a talk a few days later at the Human Genome Editing Summit, a big international conference where we'd come together to discuss, in theory, now that we have this new set of tools, how should we use them? But on the Monday, before the conference even started, this story leaked to the press. It was dominating the headlines. I went up and tried to search for reliable information and found that he had just released some videos on YouTube.
Two beautiful little Chinese girls named Lulu and Nana came crying to the world as healthy as any other babies a few weeks ago.
So after this conference, I traveled to Shenzhen, a city that's across the bay from Hong Kong, the place where this experiment was conducted. Eventually, I was able to gain the trust of some members of Dr. He's laboratory. So at a time when he was taken to jail, initially to a black site, later formally charged and imprisoned for 3 years, I started to learn the backstory about what he had done. And I actually learned that this announcement that he made on YouTube had profoundly misled the public. The babies weren't actually healthy. When that video played on YouTube, one of the babies was still in the neonatal intensive care unit. The twins were born prematurely at 31 weeks. And at that point, no one really knew. Was this the result of known problems? People who have twins are likely to give birth prematurely. They were conceived with IVF, in vitro fertilization, another technique that's also known to create problems for babies at birth. Or was it a consequence of the experiment, genetic damage from this molecule called CRISPR? Basically, CRISPR is a new tool in genetic engineering. It basically goes into the DNA double helix, it grabs a hold of it, and it produces a break. And then the cell tries to repair that damage. And in doing so, it usually produces a mutation. Sometimes 1 or 2 letters are missing. Other times it's thousands of DNA base pairs. People use the metaphor of editing to talk about what CRISPR does, but I really don't think that that's the right metaphor. With a word processor, you can type a sentence. If you make a typo, if you make a spelling error, you just back up the cursor and write it again. CRISPR doesn't work like that. It does this damage, and it's really unreliable. And you don't often know until the experiment's done whether you produce the intended mutation, the intended damage, or if it went somewhere else. Rather than editing, I like to think about CRISPR as being something like a drone. With a drone, you can give it GPS coordinates, and maybe it's going to take out the target. Maybe it's going to take out the terrorist. But sometimes a drone will take out the wedding party by mistake. It'll hit a large crowd of people instead of a single person. And sometimes the GPS coordinates are wrong. It hits the wrong part of the genome. And CRISPR kind of works like that. It can bounce around in a cell for weeks after you introduce it and produce all kinds of unintended damage. So this is a picture of Shenzhen, the experiment, the place where, the city where Dr. He conducted his experiment. It's a city that is really striving self-consciously to embrace the future itself. In the words of my friend Fan Yang at the University of Maryland, the innovation economy of Shenzhen is caught up in a culture of the new that threatens to erase any sense of history or historical consciousness. Shenzhen is notable for economic, technological, and social dynamism, as well as its capacity for cultural and political innovation. But many entrepreneurs there just celebrate values of innovation and speed. My friend Fan told me the value of speed has eradicated other ways of being and living in the city. It may also obscure other ways of imagining the future. So many of our visions of places like Shenzhen are shaped by science fiction. And I think in many ways, these science fiction images get in the way. They disrupt our ability to see clearly what's happening in this field of Asian technological innovation. Orientalism, the classic book by Edward Said, famously debunked colonial stereotypes about the exotic Oriental. In earlier colonial texts, you have stories about the corrupt despot, the inscrutable mystic, the forgettable face in the teeming marketplace. More recently, a new brand of what David Rowe calls techno-Orientalism is exploring Western anxieties about Asian power in this current era of nomadic capital. Techno-Orientalist stereotypes appear in Blade Runner as Harrison Ford hunts humanoid replicants within a sea of anonymous Asian extras. You see in Blade Runner Chinese genetic designers who are selling their wares in the black market. In a book, Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson, there's a protagonist hero who encounters a benevolent despot in a place that's called Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong. This is actually a place in Los Angeles in the future. After genetically engineering a pit bull terrier that saves the day, the creator of all these creatures, an inscrutable Vietnamese cyborg, Mr. Ning, arrives on the scene in a homemade van. And Mr. Ning, again, is a cyborg. He's a biological body suspended in a neoprene pouch about the size of a garbage can. And all this is held inside of the chassis of a vehicle, of a van that drives on the road. In these stories and many others, Asians again appear as unfeeling aliens in techno-Orientalist fiction, where worlds are teeming with mutants that are now better adapted to survive in the future. Shenzhen had a visit from a larger-than-life gonzo storytelling adventurer in 2011. That was about 5 years before I started down my own research in this area. He was a self-styled Western protagonist. He wore a Hawaiian shirt. His name was Mike Daisy. And as he told stories about Shenzhen, he blended important facts with fiction. His mission was to tell the origin story of the iPhone. He started out by asking Siri on the iPhone where she came from. It was an episode of This American Life called Mr. Daisy in the Apple Factory. And it described his undercover infiltration of Foxconn, a company that manufactures 40% of the world's electronics. Undoubtedly, our encounter today is mediated by products of Foxconn. We're talking on machines that were likely assembled in Shenzhen. Mike Daisy called the Foxconn factories a Stalinist wet dream, where up to 30,000 workers, who he described as unthinking automatons, were laboring together in cavernous spaces, under conditions of intense surveillance and control. He made explicit comparisons to techno-Oriental fiction. He said, when we dream of a future where the regulations are washed away and the corporations are finally free to sail above us, you don't have to dream about some sci-fi dystopian bullshit. You can go to Shenzhen tomorrow. They're making your crap that way today. When This American Life learned that Daisy had embellished his tale and misrepresented key facts, Ira Glass retracted the story with an apology. Credentialed journalists have since carefully documented some of Daisy's claims. Foxconn electronics assembly lines move at an unrelenting speed. Workers are being exposed to hazardous conditions. Wages are low while Apple celebrates profits. But as I made my own way to Shenzhen streets, I found that the most glaring exaggeration in Mr. Daisy's tale was a wild claim. He said that Shenzhen looks like a city where Blade Runner threw up on itself. I found that Shenzhen looked more like California, like Disney World, than Blade Runner, that has this dark, gritty landscape. I tried to understand how Dr. He's CRISPR experiment and broader developments in China's biotech innovation economy fit within this broader idea of the China dream, a vision of the future that aims to displace Western modernity with an Asian future. I visited Shenzhen's centers of finance capitalism, where I learned about the power dynamics shaping future imaginaries in the city. I talked with doctors at a reproductive clinic that partnered with Dr. He in his CRISPR experiment. I also learned that Dr. He was doing experiments in Thailand. From his counterparts in China, I learned that some of the very first genetically modified embryos were implanted into women at Stephen's fertility clinic in Bangkok. So next time you're in Bangkok, check it out. You might ask them if you can still get a CRISPR child if you want one. This is the hospital that gave Dr. He ethical approval for his CRISPR experiment. And here I was interested in studying the interplay of aesthetics and values. This is a key site that has played a role in imagining new futures for humanity. This hospital has a plastic surgery clinic where race is actively being remade. Here we have consumer-driven eugenics. You know, I found that Asian eyelid removal surgeries were taking place here alongside skin lightening treatments. And I found myself wondering, do we all want to dream the same dreams and aspire towards the same futures? If gene editing is emerging in this medical, technoscientific, and aesthetic milieu, you know, what is in store for the future of humanity? I also visited this facility in Shenzhen. It's run by a company that used to be called Beijing Genomics International. Now it's simply known by an acronym, BGI. This is a public-private partnership, China's National Gene Bank. And you know, when you walk through the gene bank, there's a multimedia display, and it has a looping video about the future applications of cell storage. This video, again, bleeds scientific facts into fiction. One slide depicts a lamb fetus that's moving about inside of an artificial womb, a clear plastic bags with tubes that act like an umbilical cord. One tube feeds the developing creature with nutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, via an intravenous drip. The baby lamb was also bathed in synthetic amniotic fluid. The fine print on this multimedia display said that the actual experimental work had been done somewhere else, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia in the United States. The researchers in America had incubated premature fetal lambs for 4 weeks in this plastic bag until they were born. Right around the corner from that looping video display was this. What we have here is a human baby inside of a plastic canister with a robot arm leaning over it, performing an ultrasound exam. And the dreams on display here are, again, nothing new. Rearing babies in artificial wombs has long been a dream of radical feminist thinkers. While many celebrated natural childbirth, quote unquote, natural childbirth in the 1970s, Helmuth Firestone openly called for a revolution in reproductive technology that would, quote, liberate women from the tyranny of their own reproductive biology by any means available. A fundamental injustice is hardwired into the human condition, Firestone wrote in The Dialectic of Sex, since it involves the reproduction of the species by one sex for the benefit of both. Firestone died in 2012, so I can only imagine her ghost as a haunting presence at BGI's exhibit about the future of reproductive medicine. The blurred boundaries between facts and fiction in the exhibit probably wouldn't have given Firestone pause. She argued that the imaginative construction precedes the technological. In other words, she insisted that we take technological dreams seriously before they become reality. Before Firestone's time, dystopian science fiction imagined how new technology might enable social engineering with human embryos. Brave New World, the classic 1932 novel by Aldous Huxley, opens with a scene in a hatchery where human eggs are fertilized, cloned, incubated, and then conditioned for different roles in society. In the social predestination room, the cognitive capacities of the alpha embryos are enhanced. These are to become the future world controllers. In another room, the oxygen flow to the epsilons is reduced to produce future sewage workers. Firestone was well aware that her vision of a radical social experiment could fail. We are all familiar with the details of Brave New World, she wrote. Cold collectives with individualism abolished, sex reduced to a mechanical act, children become robots, Big Brother intruding into every aspect of private life, rows of babies fed by impersonal machines, eugenics manipulated by the state. Radical experiments can create entirely new problems, she insisted, even when they solve some social or medical issues. A close reading of The Dialectic of Sex reveals that Firestone was a shrewd thinker. She was aware that scientific innovations can liberate some people while reinforcing other social or even environmental issues and inequalities. Firestone warned, in the hands of our current society and under the direction of current scientists, few whom are female or feminist, she noted, any attempt to use technology to free anybody is suspicious and suspect. Echoing the sentiments of many disabled intellectuals that are using deliberately charged language, calling themselves crip or cripples, Firestone warned about the coming genocide of cripples and retards for the sake of a super race. Growing future generations of humans in plastic bags could liberate women from the physical burden of pregnancy and childbirth. It could also lead to new forms of corporate exploitation. In another dystopian science fiction scenario, Saltfish Girl, by the Chinese-Canadian author Larissa Lai, we are introduced to legions of quasi-human clones who do not have mothers, just a multitude of identical sisters. The clones are patented hybrids. They're 99.7% human and 3% fish. Each of the sisters is named Sanya, and they're not designed for wits or willpower, in Lai's words, but they're genetically engineered to follow orders and lack self-awareness. When I first visited BGI in 2017, the company was flush with cash. They had just generated $14.5 billion in market capital after they went public on the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. BGI researchers had already engineered super small pigs, and they were starting to target genes for athletic performance and high altitude adaptation that might be optimized in humans. The company had developed a new kind of factory farm. They were humanizing pigs. Organs were being harvested from the transgenic pigs and implanted into people. This was to enhance and extend human life. During the opening ceremonies of an event that unveiled China's National Gene Bank, the chairman of BGI, Henry Yang, announced that the company was already rewriting genetic code with CRISPR and other tools. He claimed synthesis and gene editing will influence every aspect of our life. The launch of China's National Gene Bank coincided with the unveiling of George Church's Institute for Regenesis, a bold project to reanimate extinct species. George Church, not pictured here, that's another biologist. George Church is a towering Cro-Magnon of a man. He's a legendary molecular biologist from Harvard, and he's long aspired to bring woolly mammoths back from the dead. This project focused on mammoths was on the back burner in the United States. Technical progress on other projects was bringing Church incremental advances. Not so in China. With the Institute for Regenesis, Church and his Chinese collaborators were working with elephant embryos and trying to modify them to become more like woolly mammoths, with smaller ears and thick, hairy coats. Their aim was to create a synthetic animal, and they were basically applying the principles of genetic design to life itself. Those of you who know something about elephants that are alive today know that they're mostly endangered. Most species are listed by the IUCN as either critically endangered or just endangered. In many parts of the world, they're in acute conflicts. There's conflicts between people and elephants as people build settlements, agricultural ventures, roads, and other infrastructures that encroaches and disrupts their own habitat. When I asked George Church about where his woolly mammoths would live, he seemed naive about the real-world challenges faced by existing elephants that are intensifying in an era of climate change. His vision of synthetic multi-species futures with animals that are adapted to polar climates is out of sync with the realities of global warming. The ice caps are melting. He was dreaming about an elegant technological fix to extinction, and this is a very complicated historical, geological, and multi-species problem. The last ice age ended some 20,000 years ago. Church was engineering life for conditions on Earth that no longer exist. The gene bank in Shenzhen has a list of many, many endangered and recently extinct species who also don't have conditions on life that support their flourishing and well-being. Their solution is to collect the DNA of all these animals, some plants too. And this is like other international initiatives. So in Norway, there's the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. In San Diego, there's the Frozen Zoo. And the aim is to preserve genetic and biological material for future generations. Later, a young scientist who worked with George Church at Harvard, a guy with blonde hair and blue eyes named Kevin Esvelt, told me that saving some endangered species in the wild might not be the best strategy. He said, "I'm strongly opposed to spending a lot of money saving charismatic megafauna when we could spend a comparative pittance to biobank samples and use the difference for habitat preservation to benefit many more species." Kevin Esvelt added, "Ecosystems are not necessarily optimized for biodiversity." He continued, "If the rhino goes extinct, it doesn't matter. We'll be able to print one in a few decades." George Church delivered a keynote lecture at the opening of China's National Gene Bank. He gave a broad overview of initiatives that were already underway. Genome engineering enables some new capabilities to create resistance to pathogens. This is what Dr. Jiankui later did. He tried to genetically modify these babies to be resistant to HIV. Church said that we should apply this technique to all industrial microorganisms, to all agricultural plants and animals, and also develop more human applications. On Harvard University's official website, Church has listed all sorts of genetic targets for human enhancement. CCR5, the gene that Dr. He knocked out in hopes of creating HIV resistance, was in this catalog of rare human mutations that Church reckons can have big impacts. Church also listed the LRP5 gene, which gives humans extra strong bones. A mutation to BDKRB2, found apparently in the sea nomads of Southeast Asia, is linked to an ability to hold the breath for an extraordinarily long time underwater. This was also on Church's menu of so-called good genes. During his keynote address, Church hinted that immortality for humans might be possible. Life expectancy could be doubled in the near future, he claimed. The theme of immortality was repeated throughout China's National Gene Bank. Here you see an English phrase, "preserve for our future," emblazoned on the woolly mammoth side. This animal appears in the front hall at the entrance. Underneath, the glowing white Chinese characters have an even bolder message. The first two characters mean eternity, or lasting forever, while the second phrase spells out immortality. Taken together, the message on the mammoth proclaimed, "Live forever, never die out." During a tour of this facility, I pushed my hosts on the issue of immortality, asking them in the concrete what it would look like. When we reached this room here, where robots and technicians were methodically working together, my tour guide told me that we were standing in the largest DNA repository in the world. Living materials were being stored in live cultures, while a digitization platform transformed DNA into computer code. Careful attention to her words, however, revealed that immortality had a slippery shape. The actual promise of eternal life involves giving a sample of yourself to the gene bank. She said, "We are storing blood, tissues, and stem cells. The earlier in life you store your genetic material, the better it is for you," she added. Here, in this room, I encountered a banal technological vision of eternal life. As I work towards some concluding thoughts, I would like to bring you out of the realm of banal, everyday technoscience, as well as these dream worlds of powerful geneticists, and into the realm of other parables. In standard technoscientific narratives, the value of disruptive innovation often goes unquestioned. Market values often overshadow ethical values centered on the well-being of people and other species. So-called normal humans are usually valued above all others. People and other creatures who are deemed subhuman, non-human, and inhuman are devalued and even rendered killable. But I think the mutants of popular American culture illustrate alternatives to dominant narratives about the normative human. Two Jewish American men created the X-Men in the 1960s as a parable about civil rights and also about rights for differently abled people. You see Professor Xavier here pictured in a wheelchair. The original X-Men movie opens with a scene from the Nazi death camp, Auschwitz. As Nazi soldiers separate a Jewish boy from his parents at the gate to the camp, the metal fences violently twist and crumple. Let's see, did you see the twists? Fast forward and that little boy becomes the supervillain, Magneto. Magneto envisions a future where enhanced mutants might flourish. According to Lawrence Barron, an expert on the Holocaust, Magneto reasonably fears that a new race of mutants like himself may face persecution and eventual extermination if they do not mount a preemptive strike against paranoid humans. Although the X-Men consistently condemn bigotry and discrimination, the actual heroes in the first generation of the comic book series were all white men. Even still, the X-Men enjoyed broad appeal, since the mutant identity can stand in for victims for all forms of discrimination, not just prejudice targeting a specific group. Mutations in the X-Men universe are not birth defects, in the words of Michael Chemers, authority on digital art and new media, but these mutations are markers of a leap forward in evolution. The shape-shifting Mystique often chooses to inhabit a blue body that is covered with scales, bumps, and spines. Chemers suggests that her character combats fear of bodily difference with a disability-positive aesthetic. In other words, Mystique shows us that mutancy can be beautiful. In my book, I profile Gregor Wolbring, a biochemist who gets around in a wheelchair. He's critical of entrepreneurs and scientists who champion gene therapies as miracle cures or transformative tools of human enhancement. If everyone uses these tools to achieve the same unimaginative dreams, if everyone wants to grow big muscles or have blue eyes, and we can talk about this, like you can use CRISPR to do certain things pretty well. You can knock out the gene for myostatin and produce a child that has muscles like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can, tinker with the genes for eye color. A single nucleotide polymorphism that's an A to a T, can tell you if you have blue eyes or not. But if everyone dreams these same dreams, then we'll be left with a humanity stripped of character and biological diversity. Gregor Wolbring doesn't have a genetic disease, but he feels a sense of kinship with other members of the disabled community. You can understand people like me as part of human variation, he said, or you can see us as being impaired and eliminate us from the population. If you look closely at this picture, you'll see that Gregor doesn't have legs like most of us, and his hands and arms also look really different from the standard human body plan. And he's worried that tools like CRISPR are going to be used to edit people like him out of existence. When I first spoke with Gregor Wolbring, he said that CRISPR is really nothing new. When geneticists started celebrating this tool for molecular biology, he said that all the biochemistry community was just rolling their eyes. Scientists are only now just starting to understand how genes fit within complicated biochemical interactions in living cells. And before rushing ahead with new tools, he says that biologists should learn from the recent past. Modern chemistry has already produced profound changes to humanity. Mistakes were made that have left a lasting impact on human bodies and the environment. Biologists who are celebrating the power of CRISPR could be dangerous in their naivete. If new precautionary laws aren't passed, Wolbering wonders, will society be able to live with the new mistakes of science? Gregor Wolbering's body is different than ours because his mother took a drug called thalidomide when she was pregnant. There was about 12,000 babies born like him after, in 1957, a company in Germany, Kimme Grünthal, invented this drug. Initially, it was to treat anxiety, insomnia, gastritis, and tension, and then it was used to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. Wolbering writes, people were shocked by the emergence of the thalidomiders, and it remains difficult for people to accept individuals who eat with their feet and get around by crawling rather than by walking. But he doesn't point the finger and blame Kimme Grünthal, the company that produced the drug. He's critical instead of societal attitudes that result in ongoing discrimination. He says it's too easy to blame corporations for contemporary problems. He says industry just caters to the values of consumers. The incident with Kimme Grünthal happened over 50 years ago, but people in his community and Gregor Wolbering himself still experience bullying and prejudice almost every day. Biases frame encounters. People treat him in disabling ways. Social attitudes have negative impacts on his quality of life and the well-being of him and other people with different kinds of bodies. Gregor Wolbering appears in a documentary called Fixed, and this showcases human enhancement technologies that are being used by the disabled community. In this movie, Gregor says, "I'm happy with who I am." He insists that he doesn't want to be normal with regular legs. I actually don't need anything. I mean, if I could fly, maybe that would be okay. Gregor argues that normal bodies of humans and minds have already been transformed, again, by a wide range of chemical, robotic, and digital enhancements. He insists that it's impossible to draw a clear line distinguishing medical uses of technology from uses for enhancement. He says that genetic engineering technologies could, again, easily be used to transform what it means to be human or what it means to even be normal. Enhancements targeting human DNA could shift the baseline of our expectations about species' typical abilities. We expect certain abilities in members of a species, he writes. We expect humans to walk, but not to fly. A bird we expect to fly. Doctors are already offering people the opportunity to go beyond species typical bodies, to enhance themselves as they seek treatment for disability. In the disabled community, people talk about supercrips, people that are seen in a negative light by being singled out by broader society as heroes. They're celebrated by mainstream society for their courage and determination. These are people with cheetah legs and other what he calls super. Someone's unneeded.
น่าจะมีลมพัดเย็นๆเนาะ
So, okay, thank you, host, for muting, and now I'm unmuted again. So I'm wrapping up here. So let's see. So he wants to take away attention from these exceptional champions and think about the needs of ordinary disabled people. At the same time, he's also playful. At the same time, he's critical. He's thinking about going beyond species typical bodies. And as he talked about flying, I thought about the artwork of Patricia Piccinini, who has illustrated the diversity of mutant features for humanity. Again, Gregor said, I don't want to walk, but I might want to fly. And this sky whale sculpture, it's a floating hot air balloon that traverses the sky. It's a vision of a possible trans-species future, a vision of flight that's not based on the body plan of something like an angel, a so-called normal human with wings, but something else, something more monstrous, more creative, more unexpected. In speculating about trans-species and multi-species futures, I'm also drawn to earlier work of science fiction by feminists. In Superluminal, a novel by Vonda McIntyre, some people transform their bodies so that they can explore new environments, like the deep sea and outer space. Orca, a genetically altered human who frolics underwater with killer whales, illustrates the different pleasures, relationships, and responsibilities that might emerge if we were able to communicate with other animals and survive in ocean environments. As a student of Donna Haraway, I inherit her commitment to engaging with science fiction to think, in her words, about how mutant transformations to humanity might help us live on a damaged planet. Haraway's recent collections of Camille stories, published in her book, Staying with the Trouble, invite us to imagine risky experiments where humans might take risks to our own health and well-being in the name of helping other species. She speculates about future human children that might be modified to embody some of the characteristics of endangered species that they're tasked with protecting and helping flourish. The stories center on genetically modified children augmented with monarch butterfly pattern forming genes. Here, this is a monarch caterpillar pictured on the screen. And by having these colorful patterns, this might help the children empathize and care for the endangered creatures. She describes by the age of 5 how this fictional Camille, how her skin was brightly banded and colored in yellow and black, like a late stage caterpillar. She speculates about how this child might also be enhanced to taste delicate chemical signals on the wind, enabling a sensitivity to a world as it is experienced by butterflies. In imagining new and transgenic multi-species futures for humanity, it is important to remember that people like Gregor Wolbring live with daily experiences of discrimination and exclusion. The biologists who are celebrating the power of CRISPR are, again, I think, dangerous in their naivete. Again, Gregor wonders, will society be able to live with the mistakes of these scientists who are conducting experiments shot through with hubris? CRISPR and other tools of molecular biology are far from perfect. Right now, these tools are more likely to produce a critical genetic injury than any sort of human enhancement. Sober English language media outlets like the BBC, Reuters, The Atlantic deemed Dr. He Jiankui's CRISPR experiment with babies monstrous. The Daily Star screamed about mutant DNA babies, while The Sun ran a story simply called Frankenbaby. As much as I find the X-Men and other mutants of popular culture to be generative and getting past fears about post-human monsters, in concluding, I would like to steer away from one dominant plotline in Hollywood. Many mutant superheroes are ability enhanced. Again, dialoguing with Gregor Wolbring, we might use the term ableism to understand how society treats disabled people. Ableism is our obsession with certain abilities and the accompanying negative treatment of people who don't have these kinds of abilities. And I think we might extend that same sort of analysis to our relations with animals and other species. Thinking about abilities is one way to rethink the species interface. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, ableism is defined as discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. And it's also a prejudice against or disregard of the needs of those with different abilities and capacities. In some cases, a bias against disabled people has produced outright violence. Many of the 12,000 babies who were born like Gregor Wolbring were subjected to so-called mercy killings by their parents when they were young. Pregnant women all over the world now face new choices in the fertility clinic. Genetic tests let expectant parents make a wide range of decisions about the future of differently abled children. Many families hope for the so-called perfect baby. Even though Gregor Wolbring's own imperfect body was produced by a chemical exposure, he still advocates for the existence of people who have different bodily abilities and cognitive capacities as a result of genetics. Creating a safe space for a differently abled child or a differently abled animal, someone or some critter with a distinctive body or a neurodiverse mind, can involve a lifelong commitment of love and care. Another differently abled scholar, Alison Cafier, invites prospective parents to choose futures of disability. Circling back to the title of my talk, I want to remind you that we are all mutants. We carry around distinctive bits of DNA that make us unique, special, different, but possibly also wounded. I would like you to think about multi-species futures alongside these futures that make room for different abilities. Let's also think about Afrofuturism alongside queer possibilities and diverse post-colonial futures. As we shrug off the tired tropes of techno-Orientalism, there are opportunities to imagine Chinese futures that are shot through with multiple temporalities, values, and ethical sensibilities. There is an urgent need to work on projects related to multi-species justice, and we can talk more about this in a few moments. There is an opportunity to resist the dreams of optimized life and immortality that are emanating from the innovation economy of China and the United States. As frontier practices remake nature throughout Southeast Asia, disrupting established ecological communities, undermining traditional subsistence practices, it is important to resist in our dreamings as much as in our actions. So in closing, I'm keen to hear from you all about the multi-species futures that are emerging on the horizon in Thailand, and to think together about the coalescences that might disrupt hegemonic forces that are working in the domain of life itself. Thank you.
Wow, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Eben. Before we bust into our roundtable discussion, I want to briefly introduce the roundtable discussants. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So those of you who know me know that I teach multi-species Anthropocene studies, science and technology and society studies, political, social, semiotic, and visual cultural theory at Chiang Mai University here. And I work on the intersection of the cultural, political, semiotic, and ecological with performative and visual culture under the Anthropocene condition. And my main concern is about how do we rethink the human in a more than human world towards conceptualizing a politics beyond the human and a multi-species polity and a conceptual examination of what I call the Anthropocene, which for me is related to this sort of ontologically constitutive rupture of and the alienation of Western humanist man that became the dominant model of the human following the spread of Western thought through colonial domination and capitalism throughout the world. So the rupture of man / anthropos from nature and the unfolding catastrophic consequences that this has caused. Ciclón Olivares, another of my long-term co-conspirators and co-thinkers, who actually is the first person to introduce me to multi-species studies and to Eben's work long ago. Is a co-founder and director of Sin Cabeza Productions and SK Symbiotic, which is a research platform that spans diverse media and connects with life forms within and beyond the technosphere. Their work engages technologies of consciousness to contend with the conflicted affects of terror and pleasure and strife amid mass extinctions. And for those of you non-native speakers, terra is earth, right? It's another word for our earth. So terran is pleasures of this earth that we live in. They are a diasporic Chilombian, how do you pronounce that? Chilombian and non-binary transmedia multi-species storyteller. And they have lived and conducted research in China, India, Chile, and the US and elsewhere, including documentary and resistance work with tattooed pigs, commodified as art in China, feral canine communities in Goa in India, and Sin Cabeza's productions of video art, Evo, Devo, design fiction, multi-species architecture, and performance lectures have been exhibited worldwide, including the brilliant Worldly House, an archive inspired by Donna Haraway's multi-species writing on coevolution at Documented 13, and lots of others I'm not going to read out here, but you can read in the introduction on Facebook, and that will be on our website. And their publications range from academic theoretical writing to experimental poetry. Right now, Olivares is an assistant professor and faculty fellow at the was an assistant professor and faculty fellow at the Gallatin School of Individualized Studies at NYU, and is currently a visiting professor at the Pratt Institute in New York. And we are going to be cooking up some things for our students to engage with one another. And they are also currently studying mosquitoes, witchcraft in pre-revolutionary America, and doing work rewilding multi-species communities. Their heteronyms include Lisette Tatiana Olivares and Coco Rico, as well as Cyclone. Pasut Lasuka is our Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Chiang Mai University. And he wrote a PhD thesis at the School of Culture, History, and Language at ANU, the Australian National University, on Thai cinema and political cultures. At CMU, Pasut teaches a wide range of courses in the areas of literary studies, media studies, cultural studies, and medical and health humanities. And in the past few years has become more interested in the bodies within the context of the so-called aging society and the concepts of successful aging, which is the approach used in research and care practice in medicine and public health here to make elders feel positive about their aging selves. However, Pasut attempts to show an alternative view that in order to come to terms with this new stage of the self and socio-demographic conditions, the very notion of aging needs to be rethought in the beyond human-centric perspective. So in 2021, Pasut and his colleagues at CMU's Faculty of Humanities got a grant from Thailand's Office of National Higher Education to conduct a research project that aims to show the new ethical understanding of aging by employing research practices that are very multidisciplinary, ranging from literary and linguistic studies, and now also Pasut is exploring post-humanist philosophy of science and many other things related to the multi-species and STS world. And apart from research, Pasut is also the head of the newly established academic unit, which is one of our co-hosts for this wonderful event, the Integrative Center of Humanities Innovation, and has also had a speaking series that was just fantastic last semester, and I'm looking forward to the next one, bringing multidisciplinary knowledge into the mainstream of CMU. So these are collaborations that have all been very helpful. Just briefly, the host, I want to give a shout out to the lab and the lab team who are making this possible. This multi-species world-making possibilities in the More Than Human Anthropocene speaking series is one of the things we do at the AMOR MUNDI, which means love of the world, a term Hannah Arendt coined and theorized about. And we will be having series of conversations with brilliant scholars like Eben to try to build a community of knowledge makers here. So those of you who are excited about what you've heard, reach out. Okay, these are people that are in our network who are supporting what we're doing and are willing to help, recommend readings, get you in the loop, connect you and the research you want to do. So this is not a one-off thing. This is a relationship that we're building to build new knowledges together about how to face the future that's coming and how to make a world that we want to live in. Okay, so without further ado, let's just join in. We could start with questions because I've seen a couple, and then Eben can answer, and then the roundtable people can jump in and throw out some provocations. There are so many questions that have come up. I'm very excited to see people from the science community. Looks like they're here too. Maybe Edu, you have, I think, asked the first full question that I can see. Do you want to ask it for us? Are you there?
Hello. Yeah.
All right, let's hear it.
I was wondering, because we have so many magical creatures in the past, we dismiss those accounts as myth and magic and stories that people made up to pass a moral point or something. But couldn't they have been real, actually? Hanuman is just a fantasy. Today we talk about engineering to make like a super soldiers. There are stories that there are researchers to make mixed soldiers with human genes and monkey genes. So we have this story from 6,000 years ago when this already existed. So shouldn't we look at these myths with a different view? Couldn't these things actually have existed in the past? and these are not things for the future, but things that already existed in the past. Thanks.
Eben.
Sure, I'll jump right in. So I'll answer that question with help of Eric Auerbach, who wrote about histories of figuration. So he was writing about the Christian tradition. And, if you look at the Old Testament, you see, all these prefigured hopes about a Messiah. And then this guy arrives in flesh and blood, Jesus Christ. And, those older prefigured dreams latched onto that. And, there's a certain dialectic between the prefigured imagining and the historical now or the historical real. And I think, the ways that figures can work is, they kind of anchor dreams and they can anchor hopes. And I think, definitely figurative projects that resist the hegemony of, say, Jesus Christ, or other powerful myths that originate from Europe or Palestine or the United States. I think, there's all kinds of fertile potential. And I really think about the future as being up for grabs. Ruha Benjamin describes the future as a battlefield, and it's really about whose dreams went out. And sometimes dreams can be in optimism can be cruel, as Lauren Berlant suggests, when the dreams that you dream are either totally unrealistic, like this thing is, the Messiah is going to arrive and the world's going to be great, or when the things that you dream are too plausible. I want a promotion at work, or I want a new car, and you get those things and you're still not happy. And I think the more interesting prefigurative work that we can do right now is that articulation of trying to figure out like what ethics and values we want to attach to hopeful figures, and then doing that work to bring those futures into contact with historical reality. So I think in this talk I was trying to describe figures of the future that are worth resisting and rejecting, largely, at least the ones from Shenzhen and George Church and Harvard. Like, I think those are very powerful future imaginaries. And I think we need to engage with a lot of different traditions of ethical imagining to counter those very hegemonic dreams.
Alyssa had a question as well. If there's no comment, maybe we could have Alyssa ask her question too.
Then I see Pasut has his hand up.
Oh,
too.
Pasut. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Pasut. And then Alyssa, you're next.
Thanks, Eben, for your fantastic talk. I have to confess, I couldn't finish your book just yet, but I've gone through about half of it. I was going to save this question to later, but since Edu, asked this question that you have been answering this, I was wondering what you talked about. This kind of prefigures, and my question is just that when I was listening to your presentation would be, since you have been working with scientists for a lot of time, you've been able to write books, and you were talking a lot about sci-fi and all these novels and popular films and cartoons, comic books. I was wondering, at the kind of in the real situation where you've been working with this scientists, how much does this kind of popular narrative in sci-fi cultures, because you mentioned about I think you mentioned about, on the one hand, was all the sci-fi kind of disrupts the way in which we can actually imagine the future and possibility that it could turn out. But there's another argument about that all this sci-fi kind of help people or scientists kind of think about the possible worlds in the future. So I was wondering, from your experience working with scientists, how much does this kind of sort of feed into their actual practice in the lab, for example? I guess I don't know. There are so many scientists in this panel, in this room as well. So maybe they can share later on too. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I found that different people had very different imaginaries, and I should also confess that I'm sort like I was trained as a biologist as an undergrad, a biologist and an undergrad, so I kind of inherit some disciplinary tradition. So I was trained by one geneticist who, was a big fan of Donna Haraway, a big fan of Octavia Butler, and really thought, she pushed back hard against neo-Darwinian narratives about fitness and adaptation. She was a large woman, 250 pounds, and she insisted that you don't have to be efficient, you have to be sufficient. And she with us read all kinds of science fiction, science fiction books as she was teaching us biology. So I was kind of trained by a scientist who brought this together. And along the way, you meet all different kinds. Some scientists are very, business-like and, all about, the finance capital and producing speculative futures that are going to result in market returns, very narrowly focused on that kind of value and disruptive innovation. And then, many others. I took a class, I learned how to use CRISPR at the National Institutes of Health. I took a week-long workshop along with, postdocs and tenured scientists who are trying to learn how to incorporate this tool into their own laboratory practice. And in the book, I recreate some dialogue. So one of them was a British scientist, Ben Mead, who was studying retinal nerves and stem cells. And at a certain point, he basically started reflecting on Gattaca, like this movie about, this kid kind of destined from birth to, he was not produced with genetic engineering and had this heart problem. And like, even before he was born, there's this prediction about, how he would die. And, he's relegated to the class of waste management, but then kind of sneaks his way and becomes like an astronaut, I guess. And Ben was, as we're learning these tools of CRISPR, trying to get, we're learning these from like technical experts, like, Thermo Fisher, like the folks like who can teach you how to do this reliably. And, the message we were consistently getting from the instructors, like, there's not time to talk about ethics. There's not time to talk about these ultra imaginaries. These tools work really fast, like to stay current and relevant in the current, scientific marketplace. You just got to keep publishing and doing the work. And so there's one moment in the course where he's just like asking people to slow down. And it was a discussion about releasing transgenic mosquitoes into the world and whether or not that's a good idea. And the instructor basically said, there's no time for debate.
I found a similar explanation in, when I was really new to this whole medical humanities thing, and there's this whole argument about in real practice in the medicines, when you go up from the first year as a preclinic student to the later year of preclinic student, the idea of the notion of time that comes into your kind of classroom and workplace and hospital just so similar, and just reflecting what you just said about time that kind of keep pushing people and that kind of stuff. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
And there's a specificity to time that I didn't have a chance to go into in Shenzhen. So this idea of Shenzhen speed emerged in the 1980s, where skyscrapers were going up faster there than anywhere else in the world. And you saw that in the iPhone factories. I mean, before the iPhone factories, you had like Barbie dolls and Mattel and all this, the CD players and the Walkman. And now, we've got it making our computers and phones. And what BGI, this company, the genetics company, and what Dr. He we're trying to do is bring Shenzhen speed to the domain of life itself, where, fast, loose, and out of control, you are creating new transgenic futures for humanity and for a multitude of other species. And, what happened to Dr. He, him going to jail, is also, I think, a conflict on time and temporality. It was a moment when the old guard of the Communist Party said in no uncertain terms, like, you were doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, that, like in older sort of norms and values that prevailed within the Communist Party, like prudence, caution, the gentleman is able to perceive when the right moment is to present something. But Shenzhen is kind of at odds with old school Beijing. Shenzhen is this zone of experimentation where there's the bias towards action from imported from Silicon Valley, And you ask for permission, you ask for forgiveness rather than permission. You do it, and then you look to Beijing for post hoc approval. So I think in many ways this CRISPR experiment stands in for a much broader conflict between the elements of the Chinese elite that are all about innovation and disruptive future making, and an older group that has a kind of nostalgia for a good life that was livable, that was stable and settled, that's being undermined by these disruptive innovations that are quickly emerging, and people aren't even able to keep track of them. So like this experiment remains controversial, but no one's talking about it in China anymore. There's just so many other new things that have come since.
Thanks.
I mean, I want to jump in because you just reminded me of another aspect of your book, Eben, because at the very beginning, you're talking about Jiahe actually being kind of targeted globally, kind of by the Western scientific community as this sacrificial creature, right? Yeah. Because actually there's tons of money that's being invested, and because he's the first one who, yes, preemptively publishes this information and becomes kind of this figurehead for the monstrosity of this type of research, there is actually this narrative within your book about questioning precisely that type of legacy of techno-orientalist fear of China taking over scientific development from the West, right? And there's really interesting characters that come through from that conference, in these backroom talks. It's really fascinating. It's like we get this bird's eye view of your experience at that conference in this particular moment, and also of these artists who are present within the audience. You mentioned Mary
Magic.
I'm sorry, Mary Magic. That's right, Mary Magic and Adam Zaretsky, who are in the audience, who are people that I'm thinking with, who are also very interesting artists. So I think that's a really important intervention that you make, because I feel like you're not as quick to judge this scholar, and you go into his background, right? You teach us about where he grew up and what, all of the sacrifices that he made to be able to become this international scholar. So it would be interesting. I'm sure that you're planning a follow-up visit with him. Has he already been, is he already out of jail?
Actually, I don't know, and it's a delicate matter, because basically conditions of getting released from this kind of detention are don't make waves, don't. So a lot of people who spoke with me, first of all, only spoke to me on conditions of remaining totally anonymous, and made it clear that the Chinese Communist Party, the CPC, wants this story to go away. But you're right, he kind of embodies the story of the China dream that I mentioned during the talk. And he grew up in a rural village that didn't have electricity, that didn't have telephone, and born in 1984. He was born without a hospital, without any kind of reproductive medicine, with the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, that somebody who had sort of been present for a couple of childbirths knew that, okay, cut the cord now, it's wrapped around the baby's neck. And he didn't encounter modern medicine until he went to primary school. And so it's a story of aspirational dreaming that's of a modest sort, like, I want to go to the university. He got really good grades at school. He went to a top university in China, and then went to Texas, to Rice University, went to Stanford, and basically came back to China and did what he learned how to do in Stanford. Stanford is the heart of Silicon Valley. That's the disruptive innovation economy. That's, Shenzhen was poaching talent, from the universities. He was a postdoc in Stanford. So, it's a, common Asian American story, but at the same time, he's still embedded in these international networks. He's got his PhD supervisor from Texas in the room when he's talking with the patients about informed consent. And, you know, the Chinese American trained scientist goes to jail. You know, the American scientist has a brief ethics investigation concluded with little fanfare. You know, he's fine. All the international geneticists and genomics companies that are very much invested and interested in the same kinds of experiments, you know, they're still talking about it. They're, you know, working with regulators and legislators and other, you know, part of the complexity is that, you know, there's senior members of the scientific establishment in China who had similar projects in the pipeline, and also threw Dr. He under the bus. So yeah, he became, I think, you know, this whole moment was, I think, a way to kind of stand back and reflect. Like back when I was at that first conference that you mentioned with Adam Zaretsky, the artist, and Mary Magic, I thought the only way that humanity was going to like slow down and pay attention was that if Adam's been talking about creating a genetically modified child as a work of art for years now, and he's got some of the skills. You know, I know what Adam knows, and he also knows what he doesn't know, and knows that he would have to partner with, you know, other kinds of experts. And I thought that the only way that, you know, the general public would slow down and notice is if Adam made good on his promise. But it's happened in a different way, and yeah, it's definitely been uncomfortable for Dr. He, but I think it's a moment of really important reflection, that we can slow down and step back from the values of the innovation economy.
There is a question. There's actually several urgent questions from the audience. So Elisa, you're first. And then there's a question from Bindar I can read, and I think from one other person.
Okay.
Go ahead, Elisa.
I'll go ahead. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. I thought it was really, really interesting, and I enjoyed the whole thing. I was particularly interested when you were talking about CRISPR, and you had mentioned like during older times, like Eurocentric futures were wanted or ideal in the past, right? But in Asia, like in Thailand and China, what are they trying to change? Like, what is the ideal outcome of CRISPR in human modification? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things on the horizon. You know, I think the dominant uses at a place like BGI are focused on, you know, perceived health benefits and applications, and it's, you know, all sorts of things. Like, so I could just run through a whole bunch of genes that you could play with. So I mentioned myostatin, you knock that out, big muscles. You know, honestly, I saw some of the talks at BGI, which are really about, you know, high altitude adaptation and, you know, maybe getting military advantage in a place like Tibet. You can imagine an occupying army using these technologies. One of the scientists who I ended up spending a lot of time with in Shenzhen at BGI was a geneticist from Stanford who studies elite athletes. And, you know, part of it was really interesting talking to him. You know, there's all these tests that you can get for sports genes, like, you know, if you're a coach or a parent, you know, like supposedly these tests tell you about the genetic makeup and propensities of your student or child. And there was a vending machine at BGI that had one of these tests for sale, and he looked at it and he's like, oh, that's junk. But at the same time, he was meeting with the Olympics committee when he was in town. And you know, he said that genetically modified athletes, you can't really detect them with current technologies. So another gene that you could manipulate and that he's studied is called EPO. So it's the same pathway that Lance Armstrong tried to manipulate with his, you know, earlier doping stuff by like taking drugs. So you can do that by knocking out this gene, and you naturally have this enhanced ability and endurance. But, you know, with all of these genes, there's trade-offs. So myostatin, you might get huge muscles, but you have smaller organs, and you're more likely to have a heart attack. If you take out EPO, you're going to have enhanced endurance, but a higher propensity of strokes. So you might need to go donate blood every few weeks to avoid, blood clots and strokes. So, there's a reason why we don't have, these abilities. I mean, there's others that, have obvious military applications. There's a gene for pain that some people, naturally are born without this gene all over the world every year. There was a kid in Pakistan who became renowned among his friends for, stabbing himself in the hand, and the knife comes out and he feels fine. But he died as a teenager after jumping off a roof, like trying to do a stunt. Many babies born missing the pain gene bite off their tongues when they're kids. So there are military, one of the earlier questions was about military applications. And, I know for a fact that one of the Beijing military hospitals said to Dr. He, like, if you'd done your experiment with us, it would have been fine. I know for a fact that I mentioned this in the book, the Pentagon has invested $100 million in military applications of gene editing. So it's happening. It's not being well reported, and the policymakers aren't taking proactive action, largely. So, and Thailand's actually a super interesting place. So I mentioned Stephen's fertility, and I totally encourage, if somebody goes there, you have to send me a message. I really wanted to go, but I didn't. I went through Bangkok before I knew about Stephen's fertility clinic, like a few months before, if I'd only known. But so you can apparently do experiments in reproductive medicine in Thailand without asking for, national ethics clearance or regulatory approval. So that's why Dr. Ha went to Bangkok. He also went to Hainan, a province in southern China, an island that's known for medical tourism and where you can do things that are otherwise illegal in China. I think when it comes to remaking race, I mean, Thailand's also a really interesting place for that kind of stuff, both like transgender surgeries. One of the chapters in the book is about transgender aspirations. An Indonesian performance artist would love to come to Bangkok and get surgery. But yeah, I think race and biological bodies are getting remade in Thailand in super interesting ways. You have trans scholars writing about, the aspirational whiteness of many darker skinned people in Thailand. At the same time, you have white tourists who come to get trans surgery, but also who desire browner skin. So it's kind of this double imaginary. And, in East Asia, yeah, there is, like, white skin is also fetishized, but blue eyes or blonde hair mark you as foreign. So, there's interesting, first of all, colonial legacies associated with race and beauty that go back to the Korean War, where US doctors thought that it was like an act of beneficence. I'm going to give my translator, we're going to remove the lazy eye of my Asian translator, and that's going to be a gift. So you've got like these colonial genealogies of race and beauty that are coming together in these places where, yeah, these new futures for humanity are being imagined. So it's not exactly all the same dream and the same future that folks are aspiring towards, but yeah, I mean, it's super interesting the ways that race and beauty and all of this are starting to play out in different parts of the world.
A tiny aside before I go to several of the questions that are in the chat. You know that those eyelid surgeries that are so ubiquitous in China, where I lived for 20 years, watching that Shenzhen speed, not just in Shenzhen, but really in every major urban metropolis that was radically transforming at a speed it's almost impossible to describe if you haven't lived it. They call it Euro eyes, 欧式眼. So the aesthetic frameworks that govern what is a desirable feature are so tangled up in our shared popular cultural and technoscientific imaginaries that the decoupling of those things in actual research practices or in medical practices is very, very frightening because there's that critical gap. I wanted to read, because there's a couple shy people. There's a question from Maya Dania, and it's kind of got a long preface, but it's about how to actually engage response ability. So Maya asks, in ecofeminism and critical posthumanism, the central idea of problematizing multi-species ethics explicitly is rarely discussed. Our everyday relationships with other species, on the other hand, are often much more complex, intertwined with, and enacted through a doing ethics in practice. It is the notion of multi-species worlding of Haraway that she articulates in her book that comes closest to a counter concept for speciesism as a universal recognition and responsibility towards all species that make worlds. In my understanding, it requires us to respond and negotiate multi-species encounters in everyday life instead of more abstract, just abstractly in ethical or political theory. But it is not easy to continuously remain aware of our responsibility in daily interactions with the multi-species beings we encounter. So what does this responsibility really mean in practice? How can we further imagine multi-species possibilities more concretely? That's a big handful of big comments about bio.
Yeah, I mean, I point Maya towards the work. So we've just finished a new edited collection for Duke University Press called "The Promise of Multi-Species Justice." So the introduction that I wrote to that with Sophie Chow engages with some of those issues pretty directly. And I'm starting to think these issues of responsibility less in a kind of skin out biology way, as some of my undergrad mentors would call it, but more on molecular material semiotic intra-actions to kind of bring Karen Barad and also Karis Thompson together to think about the kinds of ontological choreography that we are constantly doing, whether or not, so outside of the peripheries of our consciousness, these intra-actions are taking place constantly. So if you mobilize the holobiont concept, where, you know, skin out biology kind of falls apart when you think about the holobiont. I was talking earlier today with a phage biologist, someone who studies the viruses that infect bacteria. And, you know, all the eukaryotic cells, all the cells of multicellular organisms on the planet are infected with many different kinds of viruses. We are constantly being and becoming responsible. We're responding to these other agential things and beings and intergenerational processes in ways that we barely understand. So I guess I would encourage people to think, I mean, you know, there's the classic stuff that Donna has done with Cayenne, her dogs, and classic stuff that, you know, if we're thinking like a mammalian centric, like there's certain kinds of recognition that we can do with creatures that are like us. But there's also modes of responding and being responsible that I think are about decentering, you know, this kind of like Cartesian mind interfacing with other Cartesian minds. One essay I'd point you towards is Karen Barad's contribution to the Multi-Species Salon. It's a essay about the brittle star, which really, you know, torques those questions in some interesting ways.
That's wonderful. Let me ask you one of the other questions from the chat, because there's quite a few. Professor Eben, how to do multi-species research and the multidisciplinary research as a multi-species approach, especially for someone like me who doesn't have a really strong background in natural or biological science? Is it possible to do this type of research independently? Can you elaborate on this? And then he continues, this is Bintar. I mean, is it possible to do this research alone as a social scientist without involving someone from natural science disciplines? Or do you really have to have a collaboration? Or is it enough to read the secondary literature? What do you think?
So I think it's, you know, what Jenny Reardon at Santa Cruz calls critical friendships. Those can be important. And I think, you know, the first generation of multi-species scholarship really engaged in a lot of those critical friendships with biologists. And, you know, for an example of that kind of field work, I would point you to a chapter of a book I wrote called Emergent Ecologies. The chapter is called Becoming Wild. And it's a bit of work that I did by dwelling with primatologists, ethnoprimatologists, Erin Riley and her master's student, Tiffany, as well as filmmakers, as well as animal activists who really not only understood how animal behavior works in shared spaces, but understood the local, very complicated political landscape that enabled this emergent ecology to persist, even though some flavors of environmentalists wanted the monkeys eradicated. I would also point you towards Radhika Govindrajan's recent book, Animal Intimacies, as an example of the kinds of critical friendships that one might develop with others who attend to animals who aren't, scientific experts. This is set in the highlands of India, in a place that's very fraught political terrain in terms of animal lives and animal deaths. Radhika has a new piece in our multi-species justice collection on spectral justice, thinking about justice in the context of specters. But her first book is a really great dwelling with all kinds of different animals, and also dwelling with specters of unseen dangerous animals that can emerge on the scene. So I think, between the Becoming Wild chapter that I wrote in Emergent Ecologies and Radhika's book, those are, there's many other kind of methods pieces. And another that I did with a bunch of undergraduate students is, what's it called? It's about cockatoos. I actually forget the paper's title. I co-authored it with Tom Van Doren, Paul Monroe, and about 13 students. And we partnered again with a biologist who is tagging birds. He put numbers on these cockatoos in urban Sydney and gave them names and Facebook followings. They had Facebook followings of like 10,000 people sometimes. And we were able to track the birds into virtual realms and also physical realms and study the corporeal interactions as well as like the social media lives of these animals. So that's another methods piece that does involve science, but it's also like citizen science.
Okay, I think we have another question from the chat. Sorry, Is it Tanaka?
Oh, yes. So
Hi.
As far as I know, like the gene edited by her Jiankui is also like speculated to be able to enhance human intelligence. So, so in your opinion, like, would it be ethical to enhance human ability when this technology is still not accessible to everyone at this moment?
So the question of accessibility is real, and we can talk about that. The link to intelligence is very tenuous. So there was a lot of bad reporting about that experiment, and that particular bit of reporting just isn't substantiated in any kind of fact. So, for starters, the genetics of intelligence are way too complicated. I mean, there's companies in the United States right now and probably other jurisdictions that will tell you they can do these genome-wide association studies, and some even are telling you like you should pick this fetus, like you can fertilize multiple embryos. They're not. I'm sure someone's doing it with CRISPR, but not above the board. But above the board, you can make a whole bunch of different embryos and get their genes sequenced, and this company will say like, oh, pick that one. That's the smart one. That one's got the sports genes, but it's all junk science. And but the question of access and accessibility is super real. So in some ways that's better illustrated with another experiment that I followed in the book. So in Philadelphia, where 10 years earlier they targeted the same gene as Dr. Ha, CCR5, the receptor that lets HIV into cells, they've also developed some new gene therapies for leukemia. And these therapies are effective. And at least for some kinds of cancers, blood cancers, it could quickly make chemotherapy obsolete. And this is a technology I care about. My mother had cancer. She went through chemo. She lost her hair. All those things that you experience with current cancer treatments. They're horrific. They're horrible. So this was the very first gene therapy approved. It was out of Carl June's lab at Penn Medicine. And they priced it at $400,000 a treatment. And I visited the center where they tested the therapy, and I was brought to the Cancer Survivor Hall of Fame. And this is in a city where Latin American communities, where Black American communities disproportionately suffer from these kinds of cancer. But the Cancer Survivor Hall of Fame was white people. There was one Asian American boy whose story I tell in the book, who is kind of the exception to the rule. But this is a technology that only people of privilege, of extreme privilege, are I mean, I should qualify that. I mean, you know, some of the there's like a white security guard who was in the Hall of Fame, but there's that question of access. You know, Silicon Valley will talk about scalability, and you know, all technologies are, you know, in the early days only afforded, but you know, only the elite can get access to them. But this is entering into a whole new realm of medical inequality. You know, a few years ago, people were really upset by the $80,000 treatment for hepatitis C. You know, this is a big deal to some people who live with this virus and have been suffering with it for decades. You know, $80,000 seemed like a lot of money a few years ago. Now with new gene therapies, we've got so that first one was from Novartis, it's called Kymriah. And now there's another gene therapy that's $2.1 million. And this is for a single dose. And the companies are trying to sell it saying, you know, this is a gene therapy, it's going to be permanent. But the experimental data doesn't show that. And the insurance companies are saying, you know, we're not going to pay for this unless it works.
Right.
Some people are doing GoFundMe campaigns. Some people, and you know, that $2.1 million treatment is for kids. So your baby's born with spinal muscular atrophy, your baby's going to die in 2 years unless you get access somehow to this $2.1 million. Like, I can't, you know, I can't afford a $2.1 million house. Like, you know, and imagine being born into that kind of debt. So even if your parents choose to keep you alive, you know, college loans are one thing in the US, right? You might have, you know, $50,000 in debt or $100,000 in debt. But imagine being born into $2.1 million of debt. These companies are not only inventing new genetic technologies, they're inventing new financial products, and they're trying to sell them as if they were mortgages, as if they were college loans that you might pay back. But it's a new sort of servitude. It's a new kind of, it's creating this new precarious kind of subject. And yeah, I think that question of access is super important. Not only, you know, it's important in the reproductive context, but I think it's also something we need to really pay attention to as the gene therapies and personalized medicines are getting developed for adults.
Cyclone?
So I'm going to start with a molecular biohacking. This is a little plastic container I bought from India. I think usually people store tobacco inside. It's empty. And I'm just going to lick it. And this is to transform a little bit of my hormonal estrogen levels. So I'm doing this facetiously, obviously, because right now the trend amongst artists is to do biohacking. And I did see in the chat that there were references to Mary Magic, who is an artist that I'm very interested. But I also kind of wanted to pull in some personal storytelling. So I'm very interested in body hacking, which is also a so-called primitive practice of transforming the body through technologies that involve cutting or reshifting, and so I think it's very interesting, this tension between old and new technologies, and kind of the discourse that's happening right now with bio artists and eco artists, etc. And I also, I also mentioned this to also remind you of what Eben stated as kind of one of the central premises of his book, which is we are all mutants. So that little piece of plastic that I just licked is, nothing compared to the amount of plastic contamination that we're actually all receiving on a global level because of the amount of plastic that, was invented in the 1950s as part of DuPont's development biotechnology as well, right? So this is like, or chemical technology rather. And so we're going to be living with the effects of that invention, which is actually very recent, for a very long time, right? And probably longer than even human lives, right? So thinking also with Pasut here and this question of temporalities and of, things that are going to be here that we invent that perhaps exceed our actual biological time on Earth, right? Or our species time on Earth. I also wanted to kind of, so I wanted to also respond to some of the comments that are in the chat. So there was Maya Danielle who was asking about multi-species responsibility, and there was Bintar Mupiza who actually asked about a project I'm working on and thinking with right now, which is about blastocysts. And blastocysts are the, it's like this is a figure of a cell that has been mutated between human and monkey cells. And this happened in April of this year. It came out, and I thought it was very interesting because we were reading Eben's book, The Mutant Project, in our class while we were reading Karis Thompson's Confessions of a Bioterrorist. And at the same time, the blastocyst news came out. And for me, it produced fireworks because for me, it was the model of the ethical conundrum, that is precisely this question that you're asking about responsibility. So what is our responsibility to these creatures, to these chimeras that are being created with the purposes of this commodification of the corporeal, right? So the reason that these embryos are being developed and eventually the idea is to grow these entities is so that we can harvest organs from them, right? And so one of the scientists who's talking about why this is ethical is because there's this argument, well, there's a lot of sick people who need organs, we don't have enough, so we need to create them. And the way that we're going to create them is that we're going to harvest them from these creatures. And so in conversation with Adam Zaretsky, who, as mentioned before by Eben Kirksey, has been trying to grow a genetically modified child forever. When I was reading Adam Zaretsky's work, I was like, my whole career for the past 10 years has been in resistance to the reproductive assumptions about my body, right? So I didn't want to have human children. I didn't want to procreate. And that kind of put me into this strange position of not being a woman, but also not wanting to be this idea of the man and being something else, right? Of being this trans species, at least in my view, this trans species creature. And so I told Adam, I was like, well, what if we tried to collaborate with somebody who's in the lab creating these blastocysts and try to get them to donate one of these embryos? And I'm willing to offer my previously alienated womb to be able to harvest one of these creatures. And I asked my partner, because obviously this is something that you can't do lightly. And my partner was also 100% on board to raise this human and monkey embryo. Although I will say that later on, as I was thinking this through, obviously there's a lot of things that we have to figure out to be able to actually carry this out, including finding a biologist who is working in a lab who's willing to, be a terrorist, is that he had to be willing to raise this monkey child with me. And of course, my partner was like, absolutely no human children, but yes, absolutely a monkey child we would accept. However, then the ethical question is, would it be fair to a monkey child to raise them in only a human household, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that it would be. Not that I consider myself human, but definitely we would have to have some monkey kinship structure to be able to have like a more type of multi-species communal upbringing, right? So this is what I'm working on right now, trying to figure out how to manifest this visually or artistically or performatically. But I do think that these questions will keep on coming up because I think that another thing that's really important in Eben's book is this question of capital. And, he does bring in this lovely conversation with Donna Haraway, who talks about genes being the ultimate commodity, right? This conception of the commodity that, and Eben just mentioned the cost affiliated with developing these technologies. And so we have to also, be thinking with the language of supply, demand, commodity, we have to be thinking about this breakneck industry and what it's selling to us as snake oil, because a lot of this is fake, right? And that's another thing that's beautiful in this research is that Eben's like, actually, a lot of these labs are not producing results, right? So, And what we see is a lot of like celebrity culture. Like, so if you watch the Kardashians, I don't watch it too often, but every once in a while I succumb. And for example, Kendall Jenner recently was talking about how she paid this lab to do a sports analysis because she's got an Olympian dad. So she wanted to know her genes, how they were going to like form. And so now she's like taking it seriously, right, to be an athlete because of this report that she received back from this lab. So we're seeing these glimpses of how that capital actually, you know, gets produced within these, you know, platforms that are, you know, media, mass media, which are also incredibly dangerous because they do what you mentioned before, Eben, which is they induce like this colonial regime in terms of beauty and aesthetics that are really troubling and that then many other people want to reproduce, right? And so just before I completely shut down, actually, I can't find it. So I was just going to push you towards this idea of genetically, of what Adam Zaretsky is arguing, which is that we really should have artists involved in the conversation about how CRISPR gets used. I mean, artists are already doing this. There's already been many mentioned here, Mary Magic, Adam Zaretsky, and there's many more. And artists are not pure or innocent either. I mean, we have Eduardo Kac, who is also, you know, has done these types of experiments and produced, you know, troubling results in some ways. Karis Thompson is really interesting in terms of her Confessions of a Bioterrorist. She gives us some good ethical grounding to think through these questions. But we definitely need artists in this conversation. I mean, that would be my final plug.
And one artist I'd like to flag. First of all, thank you, Siklon. That was a tour de force comment there. One artist I'd like to give presence, and I'm going to post this in the chat, is Tamara Pertamina from Indonesia, someone who I profile in the book, a transgender artist who basically, you probably have them in Thailand too. I didn't stay long enough in Bangkok to see, but you know, these like push carts where, you know, like you hear them in Indonesia, like satay ayam, like going through the city, like selling satay and chicken, but also es cendol, like these lovely, lovely little desserts. So Tamara just borrowed one of these push carts for the afternoon and painted it up and put CRISPR sperm bank on the side. And she's a transgender artist, and she's pushing it around the streets of Yogyakarta, Indonesia, on the sidelines of the Biennale. And yeah, just asking people, like, if you could change something about yourself or about your child, what would you change? And just kind of using it in some ways, like this artwork was performative, is what George Marcus would call para-ethnographic. She was trying to like sort of learn about people's desires. And one of the things I find really interesting about CRISPR, in some ways, is a technology, at least in baby making, of self-negation. There's this thing I don't like about myself, and I'm gonna delete it from the next generation. I'm gonna, you know, my children are gonna be different from me in some kind of way. So it was interesting for her to talk about people and talk with people and just kind of see. The subtitle of her sperm bank was Experience Trans-Species Possibilities. So it was like kind of, you know, edging towards that speculative. And this is, you know, what these technologies are about too, right? Like, you can make green glowing people. That's kind of easy. Like, we know how to do that. We've been making green glowing and red fish and purple fish, like with genes of coral and jellyfish. Like, we can put this in humans and have, you know, certain things from the X-Men are easy to do. Blue skin, totally easy. Like Magneto, not so much, but like, you know, there's these possibilities on the horizon. And I think maybe going back to an earlier question, like a lot of the ways of speaking and thinking about these technologies emanating from the biosciences are very normative. Like, we understand what a normal human is. We understand what a disability is, and we want to fix it. And part of this talk was about trying to trouble that, to say, to presence this history of disagreement between the disabled community and the medical establishment about what is normal, but also thinking about futures that are abnormal, thinking about futures that might trouble this boundary of the human and open it up. You know, and I think as humans undergo these transformations, I think necessarily we're going to have to think and rethink our relational ethics to other animals, to other kinds of life. You know, so right now the human is the rights-bearing subject, and you see in Black Lives Matter in West Papua, a part of Indonesia, where Black folks are killed all the time and not, you know, the soldiers aren't prosecuted. Like, juridical legal traditions only, you know, elevate certain kinds of people as deserving of rights. And we've got to remain mindful of that as we venture into multi-species worlds. And I think, you know, some of these technologies that are playing with the boundaries of the human, the non-human, the inhuman, it invites a broader ethical imaginary.
Let me jump in here because there's some questions that my students have been asking that will bring us back, both zeroing back in on what the connection between sort of science studies and multi-species studies is on the one hand, and on the other hand, the big questions about how can these approaches help us to decenter the, let's say, the Eurocentric, Enlightenment, modernist, humanist version of the human, and to rethink the human in a new context, in a relational, more than human world. How can new forms of knowledge making assist us in doing that? And I asked that in the context of a debate I'm having with my uncle Jack Warren, who is one of the foremost researchers on the genetics of Wolbachia, which, as some of you know, the Wolbachia is this awesome, fabulous critter that can create transgender creatures, and now it's being used to edit mosquitoes to make them all female, so that we will get rid of malaria and dengue fever, which I almost died from, you know, and Zika and a whole host of other really scary zoonotic illnesses that humans have seen themselves in sort of in a competitive battling relationship with. But as I've tried to bring my Uncle Jack into this multi-species conversation, he's very skeptical, tells me I'm anthropomorphizing because that is the way the scientific discourse has been trained since Descartes and Bacon's sort of mind-body dualism, all the way up till, you know, B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, that anything humans have or do can't possibly be a relevant way to look at other species, so that the human exceptionalist ideology blinds actual scientists to intelligence in the more than human world, language, culture, things that scientists only in the last maybe 15 years, 20 years have begun to push into the mainstream, to push back against these anthropocentric and actually kind of ridiculously self-congratulatory ideas that the human is the only species that has language or culture or, you know, intelligence or any ability to make decisions or intentionality or agency. So why do we need multi-species studies, and why do we need science, technology, and society studies to help us rethink the human? What can multidisciplinarity do that our silos alone cannot? That's a question for all three of you. And it's just my students really want to know what they can do, how they can join this new wave, because we're just building a new kind of knowledge making, and the academic structures don't support it very well, do they? So what do we do?
I put my 2 cents about Wolbachia in the chat.
Yeah.
So share that with Uncle Jack and see what he says.
I will.
But I'll let the other two respond to the broader question.
Ooh, I love this.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of it is present in Eben's book that we're talking about today, which is, you know, prefacing this intersectional type of analysis, which doesn't just come at issues from one positionality, right? So thinking about gender, thinking about class, thinking about species, thinking about ability, disability, impairment, those things, and how they make categories, right? And then, you know, for me, I don't remember who it was who mentioned something about, I think it was Eben was talking about Radhika Govindran's work, and I have read some of her and Juna Perennius's collection, which is also really wonderful, Gender Animals. I really suggest that to the audience here. It's a collection of essays that are all written from an intersectional perspective in multi-species studies. And one of the things that I feel is really interesting about having worked with wildlife rehabilitators who are not science people necessarily, right? They're common folk who have a good backyard and who want to help. You know, it's so interesting to go from a conference which is full of veterinarians and biologists who are talking to you about animals in terms of contagion, right? Especially in the moment that we're living in, thinking about COVID. Personally, I think a lot with rabies. Rabies is like the infection that I've had to be inoculated against because I was bit by rabid animals, and I like to work with species that have a tendency to have heat high enough in their blood to produce rabies infections, right? And I like to kiss those creatures. I like to engage in, French kisses with them. And, if I were to speak to my veterinary and biological friends, like they would tell me I'm performing a crime, like literally a crime against humanity in public health for engaging in these French kisses, because I'm exposing myself to disease that could potentially have this huge effect in the human population, right? And the reason I mention this is because it's important to me, right? Somebody asked about responsibility. This is important to me. So I feel like we have to take these different domains and we have to think with them critically. But at the same time, there's this lived reality, which is, obviously I'm not kissing the one that's sneezing and that looks like they're going to bite me back or something, So I mean, obviously there's a modicum of, analysis going on. But I feel like certain disciplines ask us to view other creatures in a particular way, right? And we have to be respectful of those disciplines and the training that they have. Like I'm very respectful to my biologist friends. I'm very respectful to scientists. But at the same time, there's things that I feel like sometimes that critical distancing gets in the way too, right? And it doesn't allow you to see other things happening. So, I mean, that's just like my off the cuff response.
I'm not sure if I have any sort of relevant answer to this. A pretty big question, I guess. I mean, I could just share my experience of working in the Thai kind of educational context. Is like Siklon was saying about this kind of disciplines kind of boundaries. I mean, in the Thai context itself is very strong in my experience, especially in my university, your university, Chiang Mai universities. I've been trying to work on this kind of medical and health cultures for a while, and this is just going back to the previous question that one of the participants asked as well, like how if you're not like I never get trained in science at all. I mean, I did English as my BA and going to more like film studies and philosophies and kind of stuff, but this is has become a really difficult, I guess, from within the Thai context as well, because the disciplinary boundary is so strong. But one of the that I find it's the kind of middle ground is just keep on going, and then eventually you find a group of people who share. I think that's the main one of the important thing. You start by finding a group of people who share a kind of certain interest, and you start to expand. I think that's part of the group as well. Like when you join the group, like me joining the group now, you don't really know exactly what's gonna where it's gonna hit towards, but you believe in a kind of potential that's going to turn out at the end, I guess. I'm not sure whether I'm being more abstract here or not, but yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Like, not thinking about whether it's right or wrong, or whether it's a waste of my time or not, joining a kind of and trying to explore, I guess. Yeah, that's probably more like my personal thought, I guess, in a way. Thanks. Yeah.
Wonderful. Christoph, you had a comment.
Well, more a rant than a comment, but
Rant away, yeah.
Well, I mean, I have to say I really respect you, Cyclone, because you say you respect your fellow biologists and scientists, and I've had some of the most frustrating conversations with ecologists who didn't even want to accept that you can use the term multi-species because it already means something and it shouldn't mean something else. And and I mean, so my main interest is in terms of sustainability, and I think we know that society will have to change a lot as we go forward. And I think that will also mean that a lot of folks, including our dear friends in the sciences, we'll have to have some uncomfortable conversations. And
Yeah.
Of course, art will be super helpful with that, but we shouldn't just maybe leave all the hard work to the artists as well and ruffle a few feathers here and there, a few human feathers, and see where it leads. But I mean, yeah, I totally agree with Masood in just going and finding folks and then seeing what happens.
Maybe I'll reveal some of my ethnographic tactics.
Ooh, that would be so
yes,
helpful for the
please.
students as well, and for us.
You
can all
you
learn
know,
from you.
like sometimes you say the wrong things, and like I told you about the monkeys in Florida, and you know, when I first arrived on the scene, I was trying to explain what I was trying to do, and I reached out to a key person who'd been entangled in this world and entangled in animal activism for decades, and I use the word invasive species, and that, you know, that's got the door slammed in my face. And, you know, gradually I had to, you know, it's like negotiating a shared language in any kind of ethnographic situation. You know, classically, the ethnographer goes and learns a new language, you know, whether that's, you know, in my case, Ogebageme, as well as Logat Papua, to talk to folks and, you know, the hinterlands of, you know, West Papua, what gets called formerly Irian Jaya in Indonesia. But, you know, to enter a scientist lab, you know, sometimes it's putting the jargon, what they would see as jargon, like words that don't mean anything to them yet, kind of on the shelf, and learning how to speak their language. So yeah, when I talked to the virologist earlier today, the phage virologist, like I wasn't talking about assemblages. Well, actually I am starting to talk to them a little bit slowly about Deleuze, but yeah, it's you know, finding a shared language. And I spent a lot of time reading primary science papers, like really technical stuff, and you know, in part I can do that because I have an undergrad degree in biology and some graduate training in molecular biology, so I can talk the talk. And you know, sometimes, you know, like when I'm talking to people involved in a controversial experiment, I'm not asking necessarily the social and political questions, but I'm asking about, you know, the CCR5 receptor and the binding sites and the, you know, like getting people to nerd out about the technical details is a great way to open up broader conversations. Like if someone knows that you can speak their language and you can kind of understand the terms of the debate, you know, they might be more willing to listen to your terms of debate and your, you know, the theoretical assumptions and models that you might bring to a dialogue. So sometimes I fly undercover and, you know, like let's talk about, you know, ribosomes and, you know, RNA folding in 3-dimensional space. Like I think it's pretty cool.
I think you give journalists a run for their money, Eben. Like, I think that you're setting a new bar of, you know, my first job was as a journalist, and I've often said I think it was the best job I've ever had. But of course, you know, I think that I really want to commend you on this book because it's really fun to read.
Yeah.
I think that it's so important. You know, you mentioned ethnographics like methods here, but I think that a huge intervention that you've done and that I find very Harawaiian is this, you know, and probably also Clifford is present there too, is this
Very
thinking
much.
with metaphors, you know, thinking with what metaphors we use. So like there is a role for the humanities in the sciences, right? The sciences, they tend to like repeat things that they've learned, right? So these like metaphors of gene editing, that gets repeated. But I love that Kirksey really like focuses on why that metaphor isn't the best metaphor, right? Like that really resonated with my students.
Yeah.
So when we think about these tools that we use, because we're all using language, I think that's a great segue, Eben. But then, you know, how are we using language? And that's when the art comes out, you know, and how are we talking to people and who are we talking to? And how do we learn languages that are not necessarily even, I think Maya's working with this a lot, you know, how she's using those buttons as kind of like a semiotic, you know, bridge. But we're also, I mean, but I think some of the things that I do respect biologists for is how to watch them watching their animals, right? Or watch them watching their, viruses and bacteria. That's interesting because you learn about how they're seeing, right? And then you can take a step back and ask questions from there. So I think that there's work to be done for sure.
I wanted to bring in, my students have been reading Karen Barad's, and they've been learning about intra-action. And also we're going to soon talk about reciprocal capture. And I wanted to bring in the idea that one of the things that multi-species studies is useful for in a very pragmatic way is that if we're all working in our silos, disconnected from the multiple types of processes that actually go into configuring outcomes, then we always miss parts of the intra-actions that constitute the relations, that constitute the beings that are in those relations. So whether it's ecologists or biologists looking at single species and trying to figure out what to do to help that species, or whether it's people who are looking, at one particular disciplinary perspective, without the multi-species perspective, I think we run the risk of missing how the entanglement is constitutive. In other words, that's a fancy way for the students out there of saying how the ways that our beings are shaped by our interactions with each other makes us what we are, and that we can't talk about them as individual separate units that exist outside of those interactions. And this is part of the biggest problem, I think, that the silos of academia produce, is forcing us to decouple units of analysis into different disciplinary modes that can't really be decoupled. That if we, and at the same time, none of us can understand 7 different disciplines. So the call for genuinely collaborative knowledge making is also practical, because I'm not a molecular biologist. I'm not an evolutionary theorist. I'm not a marine ecologist. But if we go a little outside of our comfort zones, working with people who are in those areas and try to establish the basic sort of the grounds for coming together, is that our knowledges alone are not going to be enough to meet the catastrophic consequences of what humans have done to the planet, that the scientific community is pretty unanimously in agreement about now. So if for not other reason than a practical call for action, our old ways are not cutting it. So I'm just, in that spirit, I just want to ask a question for everybody, including the audience, because this goes back to the sort of the mission of our lab and the mission of this speaker program. What would the human need to become in order to no longer disproportionately damage the conditions for our collective existence? Conditions which are in very large part ecological, that relate to the metabolism and the biogeochemical cycles of the planet, which relate to the life support systems of the planet, that our type of life, okay? Other types of life, okay, they're fine. Anaerobic life, they're going to be okay. Certain life that can evolve is going to be okay. But our type of life and the type of life of most of the species out there are most of the, let's say, the animal species, maybe not the archaea, but we need this type of niche. And in thinking about gene expression being activated by the actual conditions of a niche, or the conditions that an organism encounters in lived experience, the situated realities of lived experience, what do we actually need to do in a practical terms? This is a super hard question. I know no one has a total answer for, but what does our life as a collectivity need to look like to become part of an ecological balance again? What does that really mean? As a species that is an omnivore, yet places ourselves at the apex of a trophic cascade that we've radically disrupted by knocking out most of the apex predators, and then disrupting the habitats of all the different species all the way down the line, how would we need to actually live to not destroy the world and the life systems we actually all depend on? For me, this is the underlying question that each of our specific areas of research somewhere in the background needs to consider. So what do you guys think? How do we say, and we humans can't save the world alone. Obviously, that's the myth of Anthropos and the humanist Enlightenment master of nature theory, philosophy that's wrong. But what do we need to do to get back in sync with the world that exists around us that we need to be part of?
So I think, yeah, I'd like to jump right on Anthropos and, kind of chop him up a little bit.
Yes.
I think that's the right pronoun.
It is the right pronoun, definitely. Anthropos.
I think humanity as an undifferentiated mass didn't get us here, right? And I think what Jason Moore and Haraway and others point out is the power differentials. And I think this is what, as scholars of the humanities and social sciences, we bring to, the scientists say one thing, like, anthropogenic climate change. But what does that really mean when we start looking at, corporate governance and finance capital and, protest movements on the street? But I think, we're not just dealing with climate change. In many ways, I see that, it's a problem that a lot of folks are talking about right now, but like the multi-species scholar in me is much more concerned with the ways that critters are becoming fugitives. And that's kind of one of the concluding gestures that we're making in the multi-species studies justice project, is that fugitive lives matter. To think the undercommons not just as inhabited by kinds of people who might find solidarity amidst hegemonic domination, but to think about shared fugitive lives as many of us become these nomadic subjects of capital. And I go back to the ABCs of Tactical Media by Garcia and Lovink in 1997, this thing they published on the internet before the internet was really a thing. And they talk about the importance of creating agora, creating spaces of public assembly. So we're in one right now. We've created this ourselves. These are tools of, Silicon Valley we're purloining right now, but there's all different kinds, Occupy Wall Street, that was another example, or Black Lives Matter, or before that, Tahrir Square, or before that, when in Jakarta, thousands of students occupied parliament and hoped for the impossible, right? They hoped that the dictator would leave. And they didn't know, was that going to end in bloodshed, or was that going to end in the impossible thing happening? And, messianic thought is profoundly influential in human consciousness, like going back to figuration and Erich Auerbach. But I think there's other ways of thinking futurity, of thinking hope, of thinking possibility that are not about, the dictator leaves, like everything's going to change. That's what people think. Or the Messiah arrives, like it's going to all be better. Like Obama shows up, like the world's saved, right? No,
silver bullet thinking. Yeah.
We still got drone bombs, and actually Biden's a lot better than I thought. But I think it's the piecemeal contingent articulations in the realms of hope. This is mobilizing Stuart Hall. He talks about the non-essential links that we can establish. So when we're thinking about hopes towards the future, in part that's a discursive thing, like what's worth hoping for is a series of ethical and political articulations that can orient us towards a desired future, a shared desired future. But then it's like translating those dreams into reality. So my first book, set in Indonesia, West Papua, is called Freedom in Entangled Worlds, and it's about taking those shared dreams and doing the collaboration work in the historical present, often very messy collaboration work, to bring shared dreams into contact with the field of historical possibility. Like for me, that's where the critical work needs to be done. And yeah, some of that relates to climate, but some of this, and in the book, the new book, we're really pushing against Derrida. Derrida sold us on this idea that ontopology was a bad kind of politics. The linking of ontology, present being, and territory, city, soil. Like that's the politics we need right now. There's kinds of nationalisms that can push back against the predatory tendencies of capital. There's kinds of territorially grounded indigenous communities that need, bolstering. There's fugitive lives that need bolstering. And, I think it's both embracing these nomadic formations that many of us inhabit, whether we're fugitives from hostile governments, whether we are endlessly flexible subjects of neoliberal capital in the university, which some of us have become, different kinds of fugitives. But I think it's that topos of territory, pushing against Derrida. Derrida says, we must, he says we should wait for messianic moments that don't involve messianism. It's an ungrounded messianicity that he says is like waiting in an empty desert. And I'm like, hell no, we don't want a desert. We want a forest. We want figures of hope that we can latch onto and bring into the historical present. So it's like pushing back against that empty imaginary. Derrida would have us wait for nothing, expect the unexpected in a literal sense. But we need to do that figural work to figure out what's worth hoping, and then bring those dreams into reality.
That's beautifully put. Does anybody have another question for the audience, or do any of the other discussants have any thoughts they want to add to that? I know it's past the time that we said we would end, but this has just been so exciting. But I also know it's the middle of the night for Eben. Who wants to add any thoughts? Oh my God. Well, when we get talking about the big things, it's hard to stop, right? Anybody have anything you want to add or offer or ask before we let our fabulous guests sleep, I should say. Speak. We want you to speak. That was a Freudian slip. Just going to keep letting you speak. I think everyone's blown away. Anybody from the round table? Oh, a hand has raised and I don't see who it is. Invite. Who? Speak.
Okay, hello. I'm Ton from Naresuan University, Thailand. So I just want to add to what Maya, right, posed as a question. So I just to introduce myself, I'm a bioengineer myself, and I did some work in the past and also in the present on genetic engineering, and there has been one kind of belief among our community which we could consider as an anthropocentric also, right? From your perspective, right? So we have not all of us, but many of us believe that when you think about the ecosystems, right, there will be change in the ecosystems from whatever reasons, right? From the competitions among species, from the external factor, whatever, right? Species go extinct, and a new species emerge. This has been happening in the past, over the past, like, I don't know how many billion years, right? And what made difference when we as an intelligence being emerge is that we are capable of predicting the future. So our ability to predict the future is not like 100% accurate, right? But at least we have some intelligent guess about, like, what could happen as a result of our action, right? We can see the trend, and we can say, like, okay, all right, if we eliminate this species, or if we move this one species to the other place, what could happen in the future, right? In the past, there have been many other interactions amongst other species, right? And the weak ones went extinct, and the strong one dominates. And there has been, like, a continental scale, or, like, the global scale change in environment. Let's say, many billion years ago, there has been change that happened because one species of algae happened to produce a lot of oxygen, and it changed the climate, and also, like, the composition of the atmosphere around the planet, right? And so in our opinion, right, that there's no difference from what we have been doing as humans. But one advantage that we have is that we are capable of somewhat somehow predict the future, right? And we should use this advantage, in order to at least, minimize the damage that we could cause in the future, right? At least, we could use our knowledge base to simulate, what could happen in the future, comparing among like different options we could take, right? And at least, make a collective decisions, or at least, make a decisions based on, I don't know, like whatever parameter we set. But in our opinion, it's still better than, just blindly follow the natural course of evolutions, right? And I think like, that could be like one of the best things that we could do as an intelligence being.
Thank you so much for adding your thoughts. And also, it's so great to have someone from the science community here. I hope you will be a part of our discussions over the long term. It really adds a lot of richness. Before I let Eben take this question, I just want to say one thing. Martin Heidegger, who was a really important Western philosopher who's shaped the thinking of a lot of people, said something similar, which was that animals are poor in world because they don't have a sense of futurity. He made the assumption, based on zero empirical knowledge and very tenuous epistemological grounds, that animals don't have a sense of future, can't anticipate their death, don't live with the specter of death the way that humans do, can't plan, can't have intentionality the way that humans do, and thus their agency is extremely circumscribed to a kind of present continuous, and thus their value is also quite diminished in comparison to, say, the value of human agency, which can plan for the future, imagine futures. So I do agree with you that humans do need to use our capacity to imagine, to think about what kinds of worlds we can make. But I think that we know now that the grounds for assuming what kinds of conscious states and understandings of the world that other species have, that us humans have at our disposal, are actually much more limited than we thought.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
I'm sure as a scientist, you totally know this. We don't really know what's going on. Animal minds are a big area of a terra incognita for us, for the most part. Our tools for understanding that are very limited. So when we project that whatever we have onto other creatures is a lack in them, that's actually not supported by the empirical evidence. It's an ideological position. So I'm wondering if we could co-think the future with other species. How would we co-make the future with those species? And I know that it's late for Eben, so I want to just throw that ball at him, because I think you raised a great thing. How do we think about the future with, not for, but with other species?
So let's see, in part, I'm going to answer this in a talk on Friday, where
we'll have to go.
I'm revisiting some lectures by Gregory Bateson about conscious purpose and adaptation. So at a certain point in the 1950s, Bateson had some Winter Grin seminars in Sintra, Portugal, and basically, started thinking critically about the implications of purpose. Like, Bateson was really interested in homeostatic systems, and what he called servo systems, controlling systems that interact with other systems. And he saw consciousness as the thing emerging when a servo system couples with another. And he saw the propensity of systems that were focused relentlessly on a selfish purpose, the propensity of those systems to destroy the systems on which they depend. And
sounds like us.
You talked about the oxygen holocaust. So that was a moment where, life on Earth almost came to an untimely end. And, he was mostly thinking about humans. The talk I'm going to give on Friday is about a little phrase that Elizabeth Povinelli uses in geontology. So she's got this book where the virus is a terrorist, and the virus, in her words, has the purpose of replicating itself and extending itself. And basically my point is that most viruses aren't terrorists. Provanelli kind of gets viral life wrong, in my opinion. And I'm friends with Beth, and I'm not going to try to, diss Beth, but yeah, most viruses are involved in what we might call, building on Margulis and Haraway and others, like symbiogenic strategies and political projects. And attributing purpose to a caspid protein, or attributing purpose to a strand of, single strand of RNA that's bundled up as a virus, like it gets tricky, right? Like, is the purpose of this to replicate? Is the purpose of this to exist within a broader environment, an organism? So, and how do we think about these systems that come together that have cross purposes, like different teleologies, different goals, and who's doing that work to interpret what a particular goal or teleology of a system might be? So yeah, on Friday, it's called Viral Politics. I think I'm going to try to share it in the chat, but
please do, and we can also share it on our Facebook page as well for everybody here. So please try to make that talk.
We just had a panel. The first panel just happened right before this one, and then we've got a full day of events here in Melbourne on Friday on Viral Politics.
Yeah, you have got a full plate. It's so amazing that you have taken the time for us for this conversation. And I know that we could all go on all night and talk until the dawn, and then still nowhere be near done with these interesting and important questions. So I hope that you will come back to us as maybe a panelist as well in some of these conversations as we go along, and also that students might be able to, engage with some kind of questions, and with your students, and sometime in the future have dialogues that we can set up. We really want to build new knowledges together, and none of us have the ability to do it alone. So I just want to thank you so much for an amazing, stimulating talk. I will be thinking about this for a long time to come, and I think we all will be digesting it in class and after. And there are many questions that we haven't had a chance to address, which we can always send you, and we can keep talking in Facebook and other places as well. But I know that it's super late at night for you now. And I thank you for giving so much of your time and attention to our conversation and helping us build new knowledges here. We cannot thank you enough.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Cyclone. Thank you, Pasot, and everyone else. This has been a really delightful dialogue. I enjoyed it a lot. And
thank you so much to the AMOR Mundi team, Aria, especially for being the manager of this event, but also to Irene and Hannah and Pietro and all the other folks who've been putting the labor behind the scenes to make all these things happen, and to RCSD and the Integrative Center for Humanities Innovation for hosting us. We will have this up on the YouTube channel after it's been edited, so those who couldn't make it can see it, and we will keep these conversations going. And let's keep talking about the book. Maybe we can have you come and give another talk later on as students have read the whole book in a class. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
We are so happy to have these conversations. Keep us thinking, keep us on our toes. Take care. Have a good night.
Good night.
And let's keep working towards making a better future. Thanks, everybody.